Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker. I am a licensed real estate broker right here in Santa Clara County, California, ready to help you with any of your real estate needs, whatever those might be. If you'd like to track me down, you can see my stuff at soldbyrobert.com. Also, therebelbroker.com is the home of the podcast. So if you want to sort of see a running list of all the current podcasts and maybe check out some past episodes, feel free to find them there. And of course, I always want your feedback. Sometimes the shows that I do are directly related to communications that I get from you, my listeners. If you're listening to this on the podcast, the audio only version, thank you very much. I hope you are enjoying it. Also, keep in mind that you can enjoy this show on YouTube as a video. And I sometimes will post it also to Facebook, but YouTube and via like iTunes and iHeartRadio and all those are actually the best ways to consume the audio-only version. So thanks for coming along, and we're going to chat about some stuff here. In terms of quick takes for this week, I think one thing I've been keeping my eye on, some of you are dubious about my concerns relating to this, but auto repossessions have continued to jump. I'm actually trying to track down some data on what are the makes of the cars most commonly being repossessed in my local area as I talk with folks. Whenever I start to see lots of Mercedes and BMWs getting repossessed, that's when I know the real estate market's hitting it, because the last time we had a big repossession of BMWs and Mercedes, most of those were realtor cars. So, maybe I'm making too much out of that, but I know there sure were an awful lot of reasonably priced cars in the Mercedes and BMW zone right after the downturn in 2007 and 8. So I'm actually keeping an eye out on it. I mean, I like to track all the different things, right? The second most expensive thing you typically buy is your car. And the last time we saw the house downturn, the financing downturn, the securitization of subprime home loans really hit the economy in a way that affected everything around it, right? Including cars and everything else. So we had just a major downturn. And my question is, can a auto loan do the same thing? Considering how bloated auto loans got, where the average monthly payment was over $1,000. So can that trigger, just like home issues triggered car issues, which was obviously a much lesser concern, can car issues trigger house issues? Because that's what I keep talking about, right? The debt profile of people. So this isn't the subject today. This is just a quick take on things that are happening. It's something that I keep track of. I'm interested in hearing from you what you think about that. Am I totally nuts? Is there no reason for me to be getting obsessive about this data? Or am I on to something? Do you think that major downturns in terms of repossessions of cars, and remember that all the same stupid things that happened with real estate last time are happening with car loans this time. Tons of subprime lending, securitization of the loans, and loans of cars that where the loan was like at 160% of the actual value of the car. So it's crazy, and it's something that I think absolutely can nudge the overall economy into much worse stuff. When you take into account all the other things going on in terms of inflation, high probability of recession, all these things that conspire to screw over our economy, I have to think that looking at those areas is not wasted time. So that's something I'd love to hear from you guys on. And again, you can comment below if you're watching on YouTube. You can find me at soldbyrobert.com. If you're listening while you're driving to work or whenever you listen to the podcast. So feel free to reach out to me and we can have a chat about that. What is the subject today? Well, it's a very California specific thing, but it's something that tends to happen across the country in various municipalities. The California governor signed a law to bolster eviction protections for renters, and the tone of at least the AP is very anti-landlord, very pro-tenant. And I know that so many people out there are simply going to go, oh, well, of course, you're a real estate broker. You're obviously going to come down on the side of landlords. Well, I come down on the side of property rights. That's my take. Regardless of whether I'm a real estate broker or a plumber, I am someone who understands the value of property rights, and I get why it has been a cornerstone of American society. The idea that your property is yours. You can do what you want with it when you own it. If you're a tenant, You are not a property owner. You have no property rights. None. Zero. Nil. Whatever was in the rental agreement, whatever you agreed to as a tenant is what you should be held accountable for. So when the state decides to come in and make more rules and regulations, at what point are we simply talking about national rent control? Because we're going to hit the big ticket items here, but then I've also spent some time. This is one of those times when I actually sat down and I spent some quality time coming down with bullet points of why this is a bad idea. A lot of times I'll do these subjects and sort of off the cuff, and I'm just sort of sharing my thoughts with you as we go. But this is such a big one, and it is so and this isn't an opinion, right? This isn't, while I really feel like this is a problem. No, there's been research. We've had research done that shows these policies are bad and they produce bad things. If they didn't produce bad things, the municipalities where rent control actions are more common and have been since the 70s should be tenant nirvanas, right? And they aren't. The places where this was done is where it's most expensive to pay rent and to buy a house. And in a good chunk of why that is because of this interference on the part of the government. And just in the interest of full disclosure, I am a believer in the government that governs best governs least philosophy. If someone ever wants to sit down and have an adult beverage around here and discuss topics like that, that's fantastic. I don't think we need to get into it for the podcast. But again, this is another topic I'd love to get your feedback on. I know I have an awful lot of clients who are currently tenants and they are renting. If you're surprised by something in your rental agreement that says that your landlord can give you X number of days notice and you have to move out, I'm not sure where to go with that. I mean, it's a contract. You make a contract to use a resource that's not yours, right? But let's go ahead and jump in. So what did this new law in California do? This is something the governor signed into law. They were calling it closing loopholes, which, what loopholes are there when you're talking about property rights? If I own a property and I want to not rent it anymore, that shouldn't be a problem. I should have to live up to whatever contractual agreement I signed with a tenant, but that should be it. The state should have no job other than to enforce whatever we all agreed on and signed on. And that's it. But here we go. And California has always been this way, right? California is the place where if they can screw with you, they will screw with you, whether you're a landlord or anything else. I mean, in every field of endeavor, unfortunately, we live in a state where the common mantra, and we should have this on our license plates, is everything we interfere with will be made better by our interference. That's the attitude of the folks in Sacramento as they make new laws and regulations for the rest of us to have to live through. Now, as we jump into this, Gavin Newsom signed a law. According to this was a few Saturdays back. This article came out September 30th, so this is obviously the Friday before September 30th, whenever that was, probably September 28th or something along there. But anyway, so the end of September. They created rules around evictions and establishing a rent cap at 5% plus the inflation rate, with a 10% maximum. So not only have they put a limit on how much you can raise rent, regardless of what the market's doing, right? So in other words, it is rent control. It is controlling the rent you can charge. So it is statewide rent control. And it's got a 10% maximum put on it. So if the costs of holding your property jump by some huge amount because of some other goofy thing, like there's all kinds of things in the ether right now that the state wants to do. The state wants to get rid of natural gas, for instance. Well, if they start making that one of these deals where you have to comply by a certain date and not have anything in your house that runs on natural gas, boy, there's an awful lot of things that run on natural gas, from your house heating to your potential cooking, all those things. That's a huge expense that you as a landlord, you'd have to go through. And you can bet that the very first group the state would want to screw over with something like that would be landlords. Absolutely. So I mean, and some of you are probably scoffing and say, oh, they'd never do that. Yeah, they do it. Santa Cruz County is a good example of one where if you're selling your property or doing various things to it, you have to upgrade your toilets to low flow flush in order for the transaction to go through. So there's definitely an awful lot of we will screw with you. from not only the state, but then from local government as well. Now, they also point out that there are two types of potential eviction. There's at fault and no fault. At fault reasons include failure to pay rent on time. And let's not be naive about what that is. No fault gets circumvented by the COVID stuff that was going on in terms of telling us, well, you can't evict because we're in the middle of COVID. How anyone ever thought the state should be able to say that boggles my mind, because it's assuming that the landlord is not as victimized by COVID as the tenant. And it assumes that somehow the landlord has all of this disposable cash laying around that they can tap as they continue to pay property taxes, and they can continue to pay whatever other holding costs they have, like HOA fees or whatever else might be involved, right? There are monthly costs to holding a property, paying the mortgage unless they've got it paid off. The vast majority of investors I know are mom and pop investors, and we'll get into sort of a broad definition of what a mom and pop investor is in a second with an example, an article written by someone who was a mom and pop investor. And I don't use the word was just to be grammatically correct. There's a very big reason why we're using the word was, and how important that is to the discussion of whether or not these laws and regulations are helpful or not. So don't think that if it's an at-fault reason, you can actually be kicked out of the house, because it's not. If you violate the rental agreement in terms of not paying your rent or treating it or abusing the home in a certain way, don't think that that's just a magic carpet to eviction, because it's not. The state of California very much screws with you, whether it's COVID stuff or anything else, and makes it very difficult for someone to get evicted, even for at-fault reasons. No-fault rules. Landlords can terminate leases by saying they need to move into units, make repairs, or take the units off the rental market. For my money, none of that should matter. And give me those abusive comments if you've got them. I'm perfectly happy to accept them. It's your property. You own it. As long as you live up to the contractual agreement you made with your tenant, the why of it should not matter. If the tenant willingly signed a rental agreement that said, hey, and I don't have a problem with notice laws, for instance, from saying that you got to give 30 days notice or 60 days notice, that's fine. I think that's super reasonable. And I, when I do rental agreements, obviously that's in there and it mimics state requirements, but I usually even provide longer than what state requirements are, unless it's an at-fault eviction, unless it's something like, hey, if you stop paying the rent, if it doesn't get paid within a certain amount of days, eviction procedures begin immediately, right? It's not even negotiable. It's written right in exactly what will happen to you if you stop paying the rent. Of course, unless the state suddenly makes it impossible for me to enforce that contract. Because do you see what's happening? And this is the thing that gets me. They are circumventing a contract between two parties. The state is intervening in the favor of one party in a contract to not allow one party to enforce the agreed upon contract with the other party. So the levels to this that are super annoying are staggering, and amazes me that it happens at all. I'm sorry, it's kind of my soapbox. I don't get it. Okay. They pointed to a case in Santa Clara County in which a landlord evicted tenants, and in my book, as long as they did it within the confines of notification laws and within the limits of the rental agreement, fine. I don't care why they want to do it. They said they wanted to move in relatives, but then relisted the units at nearly double the price. All right, so let's take that back for a second. That tells you that whatever was going on with that house, the people that were in it were not paying market rent. And that's great for them. I mean, if that's something they were managing to do, fantastic. This feels like, and they don't give the details, so I don't know what they are, but as a guy who frequently has chats with people who are in this scenario, who own a property or bought a property and inherited a renter. So in other words, many times what you will find when you purchase a home that you're going to use as a rental, there's a tenant already in it, and they've got a lease, and you inherit the lease. One of the worst things that can happen in the landlord universe, whenever I'm helping a landlord buy a property, one of the things that we do is we go through the process of vetting the current tenant as if they were a brand new tenant. Because what I find is landlords suck at venting tenants, by and large. By and large, they don't do it. By and large, they have a conversation with the tenant, and that's it. That's all they do. And sometimes what you'll find is that even in the house they're currently in, the current landlord, who really usually is not very forthcoming, if you can get any answers from them, you'll discover, yeah, you know what? They've had instances where they've been late on rent, or they're currently not up to date. Even at the time that you're trying to buy that property, they're not up to date on the rent. So, and this can often cost you a little bit more on a purchase price, and we can have a conversation about this. I often like to put in the purchase contract that the home must be vacant. And that may make the escrow have to go much longer. It may have to now go 60 days or whatever whatever the notification time is. But that a requirement of the purchase is that the tenant be out. And that's usually because we've discovered that they're not even current on the current rent, and or we, through our own tenant screening process, have discovered this person is not a reliable renter for whatever reason. They have a history of defaulting on rents, or being very abusive of a rental property and then skipping and leaving without paying that last month's rent. The thing that also kind of gets me is this standard operating procedure as portraying tenants as these completely innocent parties who are being taken advantage of. Does that happen? Sure. Is it super common? Not in my experience. That is the minority case. And when I come across an investor or a landlord who is treating a tenant poorly, I tend to point that out. I see one of my jobs as being a peacemaker between parties. I find that happens all the time, whether we're talking about a divorce situation or we're talking about landlords versus tenants. When I'm interacting with these folks, part of my job is to find out what everyone's facing. What are the realities the tenant is facing? Is this a tenant who is a fantastic tenant and has had recent problems that need to be addressed in their life? Now, and is it appropriate for us to try to participate in a remediation process for that person? Or is it more appropriate to go through with eviction? So we're in a position now where we've already discovered whatever was going on, the tenant was not paying a market rent. And you don't get to complain about that if this is not a property under rent control. If you are someone who has to pay half the rent that's normal for the market, you need to look for rent control. You apparently are in a situation where rent control would apply to you. I don't agree with rent control anywhere. I think rent control hurts everybody. And we're going to discuss in a minute how it raises prices, does not lower them overall, and over years destroys markets for renters. And that's exactly what's happened in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, all the places where rent control exists. Those areas where it exists have caused more problems than they've ever hoped to solve, and then not solved the problem they were designed to solve. But no one wants to admit that, because it chips away at this idea that government folks stepping in to solve a problem don't tend to solve it. They tend to make it worse. And no one wants to admit that. Even if the data clearly shows that your policy stinks, you can't admit that for some reason in American politics. Don't know why. I love how in other countries, particularly the UK, you'll get guys who will stand up and go, yeah, we tried this. Totally didn't work. I think the last time, forgive me, I have a history degree. I think the last time we had anybody honestly say, we tried it and it didn't work in American government was Henry Morgenthau, Secretary of Treasury under Roosevelt. And I'm sorry, this is so weeds, but it's popping in my head. When he was testifying before Congress, basically said, we tried all of this stuff. And this was in the 30s, right? This was all the stuff that the government did to try to get us out of the Depression. And said, you know what? We screwed it up. We made it worse. And it's the last time in a big issue thing where I've ever heard anyone admit, we screwed up. We need to do something else. I still haven't heard anybody say we screwed up with anything else recently, whether it's the withdrawal from Afghanistan or anything else. I mean, people will accuse folks of that, but no one steps up and says, we totally botched that and we need to do better next time. I would be stunned if that ever happened. And I don't care if we're talking about a Democrat or a Republican. Nobody wants to own the whole, you know what, we need to come up with a new strategy. And that is my long-winded way of saying that is rent control in a nutshell. It is that thing that no one wants to admit. It is a fundamentally flawed, corrupt process that causes the problem it's designed to solve and a whole bunch of other problems. Okay, under the new law, for those of you who've been listening to my show for a while, from my tone and how I'm speaking, you know that this is one of the raw shows, right? This is the ones where I get all full head of steamy. Under the new law, landlords moving into their units or renting to family must also identify the people moving in. So you got to tell the state who's moving in. The rental must be occupied within 3 months of eviction, and they must live in the unit for at least a year. Why? Why does any of this matter? It is basically rent control. This turns the state into a rent control zone. Bad, very bad. And as someone who in the late 80s, early 90s dealt with rent control properties in various areas of Santa Clara County, man, does that stuff suck. But anyway, let's see. Those who evict tenants to renovate properties must include copies of permits or contracts, among other details, when serving eviction notices. So this is clearly saying you no longer own your property. You are so subservient to some sort of bizarre bureaucratic level that's being created. You need to get micromanaged into why you want someone out of your property. When we should all just step back and say, okay, hold on a second. What is the best thing to do in the light of property rights? Two parties have come together and agreed, I'm going to rent your house. And I'm going to rent you my house. Here are the conditions and terms under which we're going to rent this house to you. If you violate any of these terms, you're out. Landlord, here's the stuff I'm going to promise to do as your landlord. If I violate any of this stuff, you get to sue me. I'm not sure where the ambiguity is, but it isn't in property rights. So here we are in a scenario where, for all intents and purposes in California, when it comes to renting your house, you don't own your house anymore. Anyway, all right. Landlords who do not follow through will have to allow evicted tenants to move back under the original lease terms. Quote, and this is someone I'm going to put on my new list of people to track and see what they say. Today is a victory for all Californians. No, it's not. It is a victory for the Californians who rent and who typically are poor renters. That's what it's a victory for. Because let me tell you something else about the realities of renting, particularly when it comes to mom and pop renters. Do you want below market rent? Then pay your rent every month. If you're someone who is renting a house right now and you pay promptly each and every month, and when the landlord drives by, he doesn't see a bunch of junk piled up on the porch, or doesn't see cars parked on the lawn, doesn't see damage to the property. If you're treating the home with respect and you're living up to your requirements as a tenant, you're going to pay below market rent. Why? Because renters like you are worth their weight in gold. You are awesome. And I know plenty of folks who are currently $500 to $1,000 below market rent, and they're going to stay that way when their lease gets renewed in a year because they're awesome. So if you as a tenant want to solve your problems, be awesome. Just live up to your word. Whatever you signed, live up to it. Don't abuse the property. You want to drill a hole in the wall? Ask the landlord. Probably says that in your rental agreement that you're supposed to ask before you make modifications like that. So just live up to it. It is a very simple strategy for you to be the most desirable renter. And here's what's awesome about that. That reputation follows you. You rent for 5 years and you're an awesome tenant and you decide, you know what, I need a bigger place, or I need a smaller place, whatever the reason, you need to move, or I've got a new job, so I'm going to move to a new location. If you've treated your landlord with the amount of respect that the state wants the landlord to treat you, you're going to be a winner. And you're going to be the first one to get chosen every time you apply to another property, at least for any landlord that actually does a background investigation on you, which should be everyone. Sadly is not. But your odds are dramatically increased, right? Okay, that was it for that one. But I wanted to hit this one because I thought it was super interesting. I'm amazed at how few articles are out there about why this is such a bad idea, why it sucks so completely. But anyway, Orange County Register. This is written by Stephen Maviglio, I think. September 28th, 2023. Rental rates in California housing markets over the last several years, up 56% in LA County and up 44% in the San Francisco metro area since 2015. Crazy. Those are crazy numbers. An analysis by JP Morgan Chase finds that 41% of U.S. rental properties are held by landlords who own 3 units or fewer. That's the national number. I don't know what the number is in my area. And the area where I communicate with landlords the most is probably Sunnyvale and Cupertino down to Gilroy. I mean, I've got a couple of folks who have rental units that are in, I guess you could call them sort of satellite cities, like Salinas, like Los Banos, Stockton, South Sacramento. I've got some folks who I talk to who, and we casually converse about how they're doing and what their business is doing or how their properties are doing. But these are all folks who own less than 3 units. And maybe my experience is slanted, but I would guess it's higher than 41% in my local area in terms of mom and pops versus industrial, right? But not true in every area. In Palo Alto, East Palo Alto, for instance, I know a ton of those properties got bought by giant corporations like BlackRock size property management corporations. Let's see. And they had I guess we'll go ahead and I didn't highlight this, but I think we should go ahead and say it. His experience was he had a property on the East Coast somewhere. Instead of selling it, kept it and rented it. He had a tenant, quote, who simply decided to stop paying rent, protected by COVID-era rent rules. He just stayed put while I continued to make mortgage payments, pay utilities, and keep up with taxes. It wasn't because of a hardship. He posted pictures of himself on beaches in Central and South America on Instagram during this period. Once he finally did leave, he just moved out of the country without paying his debt. Now, let me just say, speaking on behalf of landlords everywhere, there are really bad tenants out there who really abuse landlords. It happens a lot. Of course, those are the stories that you hear the most because that's what people are going to talk about. Landlords that have an amazing experience with a tenant aren't typically going to be too chatty about that, simply because we tend to complain more than we tend to praise when it comes to these kinds of things. But luckily for me, I've got folks who I talk to on a regular basis, so I get to hear the good and the bad. And I'd say for my clients who I've been able to advise on how to screen tenants, these complaints are far lower. It's 1 out of 10 maybe that they have a problem with. For the ones that have consistent problems, once I ask them what their tenant review process is, I discover that it's as close to nothing as it could possibly be. I even had one client who I actually don't work with anymore because she just insisted on doing really unwise things. She would have her current tenant find the next tenant. And she just kept doing that. And she finally got stung and she wanted me to solve that problem for her. And I'm like, you're, and this was in the middle of COVID. So I'm like, you're basically hosed. You have no choice here. You're hosed. But this is the punchline, right? So this is the experience they had with a tenant. And in the end, to cut his losses, they sold the house, taking it off the rental market. That's what happens when mom and pop property owners get squeezed. And when we're talking about mom and pop folks, their tolerance for these kinds of things is far lower than the industrial, right? That have policies and procedures and check boxes that they're checking all the time. And that's not good for tenants. Having the market lean more away from mom and pops to big industrialized, huge corporation style landlords is not good for tenants for a variety of reasons. One, the large corporate managers, particularly if they have a very strong lobby in different states or counties, are going to find far less impediments to their ability to evict. That's the way it always goes. The big players who can put a whole lot of money into political piggy banks find that they can get away with more than mom and pops, who obviously can donate 20 or 30 bucks, but they can't donate 20 or 30 million. And that's just an unfortunate reality. I would much rather see a market dominated by mom and pop. If we had a mom and pop rental market where 90% of the rentals out there were mom and pops, I think we'd be much happier. And I think we'd have closer to that number if these rent control things didn't exist. Whatever the conceptual appeal of rent control may be, we know what happens when it actually gets implemented. A few years ago, researchers at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and I've mentioned this study before on this show, studied the long-term effects of a 1994 rent control law in San Francisco. Their conclusions were not what those who created the system were hoping for. They found that many owners of rent-controlled units sold their properties to owner-occupants or redeveloped their buildings, reducing rental housing supplies by 15%. Quote, while rent control prevents displacement of incumbent renters in the short run, the study found, the lost rental housing supply likely drove up market rents in a long run, ultimately undermining the intent of the law. So to translate that into normal talk between you and I, the number of folks who wanted to rent under those legal limitations dwindled, stopped. So the supply of rental properties went down, which drove the price up. So the exact opposite of what the intent of the law was what was achieved by the law. Let's see. Los Angeles and San Francisco have had some form of rent control in place since the 1970s. In the decades since, they have become among the most expensive housing markets in the nation. So there you go. I think those are some exceptionally good anecdotal examples, a good reference to what the effect is of rent control. And that's not the first study. I've been, ever since I was way back in college and we were having debates about one thing or another, rent control research and rent control results have always been debated. But so let's hit down my list. This is my list I made while I was sitting in that very chair, trying to think about all the ways that rent control impacts the market. Impact on housing supply. Stricter regulations discourage landlords from entering the market or investing in new properties, reducing the overall housing supply in the area. Now, one reason why the local market has been so attractive is because there's two ways you can make money. There is the I'm renting my house, and that is positive cash flow. And there is the my property is appreciating. So I'm getting appreciation and rent. That's been a very dominant thing here forever, with the exception of times when people thought that the sky was falling and we would stay in a 2008, 9, 10, 11 housing burst balloon forever. Of course, that isn't the way it works. We always come out of something eventually. It's just a matter of time. But we are now entering into a time when the idea that home prices will be going down over the next year to 18 months isn't crazy. It's not conspiracy theory stuff. It's not tinfoil hat stuff. There are absolutely numbers and dynamics at play that make it reasonable to have a discussion about a decline. And on Twitter, you're going to find people calling those folks doom and gloomers. And I understand it if you're talking with someone who's having a very irrational argument relating to this. But when you're looking at past performance and when numbers go negative or don't go negative, and when that happens, it tends to precede a huge downturn in real estate. These are things that aren't up for debate. They do happen. So what we have to believe is that in this case, it won't happen. Even though it happened every single other time over the last 30 or 40 years, it won't happen this time, that when this number drops to a certain amount, we see a drop in home prices, which isn't super logical to me. And that's something else we can get in on a future show. But the bottom line is the housing supply of rentals is key. You increase the supply and prices go down. That is the way it works. Now, prices still continue to go up in many areas. They're stabilizing at certain sizes. I'm finding that 2-bedroom units are starting to drop in many markets where they've typically been hot, which is always the first indicator that there is probably more downside coming in rentals. And in addition to that, the expectation that your home's going to appreciate in the relatively near financial term, like in the next 3-4 years, is less enthusiastic. So what I'm finding is many buyers today who want to buy a investment property are fine with areas where the home prices have been relatively flat, where over the last 15 years, there has been very little increase. It's sort of been gradually going up. And there are absolutely communities out there that have done that sort of thing. But then you're relying entirely on the rent as the income, and you're not anticipating a huge amount of appreciation as part of the equation. Rental affordability. Increased regulations might lead to higher costs for landlords, which could be passed on to tenants in the form of higher rents, making housing less affordable for many. It's not might. I don't know why I wrote the word might. Higher costs for landlords. It will lead to higher costs for landlords. Regulations always increase cost. That's the nature of a regulation. Compliance typically costs time, money, effort, and that's always going to be reflected. And it's a pain in the butt, right? So the compliance factor makes it to the point where if I have to add an extra X number of minutes per week to fuss with this, I want to make more, so rents go up. Reduced maintenance and upkeep. Higher costs due to the regulations lead to landlords to cut corners, and maintenance and upkeep potentially impact the quality of rental properties. Stifling innovation. This is one I got from, this is the result of conversations with tech folks I've talked to. Excessive regulations stifle innovation in the real estate market, discouraging landlords from trying new approaches to provide better housing solutions. I think this is absolutely true. I think that there is still room for plenty of innovation, but the more government gets involved in the thing, the less innovative it's going to be, because there's not just the question of, there's the question of, will it violate some sort of regulation that may get interpreted in a way I don't anticipate? So it just puts cold water over the whole process. Impact on small landlords, our mom and pops. Small landlords might find it financially challenging to comply with new regulations, leading them to exit the market, reducing the diversity of housing options. Absolutely true. It is proven by the research. It happens every time. And in that Stanford study, in a relatively short period of time, we had a 15% drop in the number of available rental units, which isn't good for that market. Obviously, it will increase the cost. Limiting flexibility. Regulations might limit landlords' ability to adapt to changing market conditions. Boy, is this absolutely true. And this is also true when someone buys a home that had been occupied by an owner that they want to convert into a rental. If it's, and the example I used before where there was already a tenant in it, that carries with it a whole bunch of potential problems, particularly in the face of these new laws from California. But if you're buying a property that is not a rental property today, you're dealing with a different kind of competitor in terms of who you're competing against as a buyer, and you're dealing with a different kind of seller. So that transition, all of the things going on in the current market that have been created in many ways by rent control efforts that have increased the cost of homes, they also increase rent rates, because that person who's buying a home that was previously owner occupied, trying to convert it into a rental, is naturally going to face higher costs, particularly today with higher interest rates. And what you end up finding is the only way that these purchases can work is if the buyer, the investor, is coming in with far more than 20% down. They have to have a huge percentage in the deal in order for it to be positive cash flow given current rents. And even if those rents are exorbitant or seen as exorbitant by some folks, it may not cover all the costs of ownership of that property. It may not cover the mortgage. I mean, if you have a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in Morgan Hill, likely you can rent that thing for $4,000 a month, but you're going to pay $1.2 million for it. You may get as lucky as paying $990,000 or $980,000. I think I just saw one go for a 3-bed, 2-bath. But in many of those cases, you're going to find those have HOA fees in addition to your mortgage payment, in addition to insurance, in addition to whatever else. And once you add all of those things up, I mean, your mortgage is probably going to be what? $3,000 at least for that house, depending on how much you put down. I mean, if we assume a 20% down. So the bottom line is you have to charge more to try and break even. And of course, hoping you do that math before you purchase the property to see if homes are actually renting for that amount. But in many cases, these mom and pops that are converting current owner occupied homes into rentals are super tight. They're not making thousands a month. They're making a handful of hundreds of dollars a month, which is often okay for some folks because they see appreciation as a major part of it, which in today's math, I don't think is as robust. I don't think you should be counting on a ton of appreciation in today's market in many local areas. Next, legal challenges. Complicated regulations might lead to legal challenges consuming time and resources for landlords and tenants, making the rental process more cumbersome and intimidating so that landlords just don't even want to bother with it at all. You create this wall of regulations, landlords are going to look at it and go, or potential landlords, aspiring landlords are going to say, forget it, I'm out. I'm just going to sell it. And it'll be owner occupied, and it'll be yet another property that's going to go out of the rental pool into the owner occupied pool. Property values. Regulation could lead to a decrease in property values, affecting not only landlords, but also homeowners in the area. A reduction of rental housing, excessive regulations might discourage landlords from maintaining their properties adequately, leading to the deterioration of rental housing quality over time. Market distortion. Too many regulations distort the natural market forces, leading to imbalances between supply and demand and potentially creating housing shortages in the long run, which will then increase rents. Rents go up under that kind of scenario. Inefficiency. Regulations might lead to inefficiencies in the allocation of housing resources, making it harder for tenants to find suitable housing options. Impact on economic growth. Overly strict regulations could hinder economic growth by discouraging real estate investments, impacting related industries and job creation. And also, with these regulations of what can and can't happen and recovering as a property owner, it could stifle the creation of apartment complexes. If it is more difficult to reclaim a non-performing unit, in other words, the tenant's not paying the rent, and get a paying tenant in there, those are costs that you have to carry for a longer period of time. So if you've got an apartment complex that you're running, then why do it? Why not convert it to condominiums and just say, see ya, go ahead and sell them for $700,000 a pop and make all your money and go away. I've seen that happen in several scenarios since I started in real estate in 1988. And some of the logic, particularly in some up the peninsula, was exactly that. I'm going to convert these apartments to condos because the rules for renting are making it untenable. And that was way back. That was way back in the olden days before many of these rules were even in place. So that was sort of my list. That was sort of my 12 things off the cuff that I thought were important. I would love to hear what you think. This is a subject that I think the less the government gets involved, the better. Simply enforce the contracts that have been agreed upon between tenants and landlords. Feel free to create you got to give them 30 days notice or 60 days notice or 90 days notice, whatever that might be. I think those are reasonable. And I personally don't think more than 60 days is needed. But again, if for some reason we think that number needs to be different, I think that's something in the margins we can talk about. But all these other things that specifically limit how much you can charge and when you can and can't put someone out of the property, if it's your property, you should get to do whatever you want as long as it falls within the parameters of the agreement that both parties signed. So am I a cold-hearted, horrible man for believing those things? Let me know. I would love to find out what you think. And I'd love to see if you've got other solutions or other observations relating to this subject that you think I've missed or that are a huge element that really should be taken into account on this particular topic. All right, folks, the goal is to always leave you with more knowledge on the table than we take up in your time. Absolutely hope we've achieved that today. Thanks again for listening, and I will talk to you all next time.